Welcome everyone for our lunch and learn today. We are super excited to have you here, and we're super excited to have Dr. Josh Ambar, our wonderful board member and expert in all things counting autism. So I'm going to let him give a better explanation of himself and what he does. And you can share your screen when you're ready, Josh. I'll let you take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much, Kate, and thank you all for having me here. So my name is Dr. Joshua Anbar. I am a assistant teaching professor up at Arizona State University. So you guys might be wondering, why am I down here talking to you guys in Tucson? Well, first and foremost, I actually earned my doctorate in public health from the U of A, the Melanie Zuckerman College of Public Health, and I've been involved with the Autism Society for going on 6 years now. So I'm very much connected to the Tucson community, and just because I ran 100 miles north, because that's where jobs took me and so forth, doesn't mean that I forget where I come from and forget the importance of the work that I do for everyone in the state of Arizona, not just in the Phoenix area or not just in Pima County. So on top of my teaching duties, one of the things that I do is I am a principal investigator, a PI, on a CDC-funded public health surveillance effort that tracks autism and developmental disabilities. And that information that we collect here in Arizona, we subsequently feed to the CDC, where the CDC does data analysis, and that helps determine that big 1 in 36, currently 1 in 36 number. So that big number of what is the prevalence of autism. We in Arizona contribute to that. And in fact, that's what I'm here to talk to you guys about today, which is what exactly is it that we do in terms of public health surveillance? How are we tracking autism? Why are we doing it? How do we in Arizona contribute? And what does it all mean, right? We collect this data. What do we do with it? So we're going to kind of go over all of that in our time together. And I know that there's only a couple of us here in the room. So if you guys have any questions at all, please feel free to raise your hand virtually, of course. And that should grab my attention. I do have you guys on the side of my screen here. And if it doesn't grab my attention, I'm sure Kate can interrupt me, and I have no problem with being interrupted. So what exactly are we going to be doing together over the next little while? And specifically, we're going to go over the history of the CDC autism surveillance. As current as this stuff is, there is history behind it, and that history is really important. We're going to talk about Arizona's contributions to this project, and we're going to talk about the data itself, because unpacking that is really important. And then, of course, we'll talk about, well, what do we do after we have the data, and what do we do after we know that there's 1 in 36 kids have autism? What does that mean that roughly 3% of the population has autism? So first and foremost, why are we tracking autism? Why is this important in the first place? This is a really big question that frames how and why we do certain things and why we track certain pieces of information. One of the big reasons we track autism is because, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, autism is a pervasive kind of challenge. It affects life not just in school, but at home. It affects life in social interactions, as well as in employment interactions. It really affects all aspects of life, and it affects people who don't directly have autism, right? It's affecting their families, it's affecting their loved ones. So one of the reasons that we track autism is so we can understand the challenge that we're facing. Another big reason why we track the prevalence of autism is because, A, we need to know where those people are. Are they evenly distributed in our communities, or do they cluster in certain places? What are the potential risk factors that lead to someone being diagnosed with autism? When do diagnoses occur? Who's engaging those diagnostic processes? These are all things that we collect, that we analyze, that can help us better intervene and better solve the challenges that we face in the autism community. So why did this all get started? Where did this all come from? Well, prior to the 1990s, and really prior to the late 1990s, autism was considered a very rare condition. In literature that you guys may read, or that anyone may read, that was published in the 1980s or earlier, often when it talks about autism as affecting only a handful of individuals per 10,000 people. And in public health and in population health, when we often talk about numbers, we talk about them in the context of X number of individuals affected per 100, per 1,000, per 10,000. And part of that is so that we can really granularly grasp how a population is affected, especially in a country where there's 330 million people living in it. And even back in the 90s and 80s when it was only 200 million, we can really start to get a grasp on how significant and pervasive a challenge is. So prior to the 1990s, autism was considered a rare condition. It happened. There is lots of history of autism being identified in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. It became part of the diagnostic lexicon, not the common language that we know and appreciate today, but clinicians started diagnosing it pretty regularly after the 1940s in this country and in countries around the world. And so, it's not that we didn't know that autism existed. We certainly knew that, but it was an obscure challenge. In the mid-1990s, however, there was an elevated rate of autism diagnoses in a small town in New Jersey, specifically Brick Township. This is a small town in New Jersey. Nothing really exceptional about this town. It was kind of like your middle class 1990s era location. And so they're diagnosing all these cases of autism. And the pediatricians and the hospitals and the health systems there got together and said, uh-oh, what's going on here? We're diagnosing autism. Are we actually diagnosing autism correctly? And if we are, what's causing this apparent cluster of autism cases? Because again, we're talking about a condition that until this time was thought to affect 1 or 2 or 3 out of 10,000 people, right? We shouldn't be seeing large numbers of cases. So they picked up the phone, they called the CDC, because that's what you do when you discover a potential disease or condition outbreak, and there's not a readily available explanation. So they picked up the phone, they called the CDC and said, hey, we're seeing all these cases of autism around us. We don't know what's causing it. Can you please come and, double check our work, essentially? So the CDC came out to Brick Township and they took a look and they said, okay, yeah, there are clearly a cluster of cases of autism, but we don't know why that would be. There's no pollution in the water that we're aware of. There's no pollution in the environment. There wasn't some kind of radiation exposure. Aliens didn't descend from Mars. Right? There's no plausible explanation. So the CDC said, okay, you know what? We're going to go back to Atlanta, where we're based, and we're going to check our own backyard, right? See if this is, maybe there's something specific to New Jersey. Maybe you guys in New Jersey are just weird. But we're going to go and we're going to check out our own backyard. And they did. And they found the same thing. They found that there had been this spike in cases of autism. And there were, and when they went and were examining children who hadn't been formally diagnosed yet, there was this whole process where they were finding, oh, there are individuals affected by autism, and they are in much greater numbers than we thought they were. And so that's kind of 1997, and that's kind of where everything gets left. So the CDC figured it out. So between 1998 and 2000, there was a lot of parent groups lobbying Congress to do something about this, because this heretofore relatively rare condition had all of a sudden sprung up all over the place. It's at this time that there was concern over the MMR vaccine, Dr. Andrew Wakefield's fraudulent study that alleged to show a relationship between the MMR vaccine and autism was published. That was later retracted 12 years later. But this is the cultural moment that was being lived in the late 1990s and into the turn of the new millennium. So parent groups are lobbying Congress to do something. And so Congress finally does decide to do something. They pass the original Autism Cares Act, I believe, but I could be wrong about the name of the legislation. But they pass a package that, among other things, provides services. It provided federal funding for services for, in particular, children affected by autism, as well as surveillance to figure out what is the nature of the problem we're dealing with. How many individuals are affected by autism generally? And so that surveillance effort started in 2000. And so the real question was, and it was a twofold question, was what exactly is the prevalence of autism and why is it the case? These are the big questions that were being asked. And that's why this surveillance system exists 23 years later to, in part, answer these questions. So when we think about the surveillance system that was developed, it was entitled through the CDC, the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network. The goals of this network were to describe the population of children who, with ASD. We wanted to, what were their characteristics? At the time in 2000, we knew nothing. Was it a disease that affected primarily minority children? Did it affect primarily non-Hispanic whites? Did it affect people at different rates? We wanted to know the spread across the country, because even today, as was the case in 2000, we didn't know what was causing autism. And as little as we know today, if it's conceivable, we knew even less 20 years ago. So we wanted to see, are there different rates of autism around the country? And we wanted to explore, why could those different rates exist? We wanted to measure the progress in early autism identification. We know, and we've known for decades, even centuries, that early intervention and engaging in prevention methods is always better than intervening later. So the earlier we can get someone diagnosed and earlier we can make services available to someone, the better their life outcomes will be and the more positive their life outcomes will be. So we wanted to see how early children were being diagnosed with autism and could we make changes to that? And we also wanted to identify changes in autism occurrence over time, because this is something that kind of popped up and really blindsided a lot of people in a lot of ways. So we wanted to see what's happening. And then we wanted to see the impact of autism and other related conditions, other developmental disabilities on US communities, right? This is kind of the big five-fold mission of the surveillance network in this big public health surveillance process. So data is collected from across the country. Currently, the CDC is collecting data from 15 sites scattered around the United States. You can see us here in Arizona. There's a site in San Diego, out in California. There are 2 sites in Texas, one in Austin and one right on the border in Laredo, Texas. For the first time in the Autism Surveillance Network's history, we're collecting data in Puerto Rico. But we collect data up in New Jersey, in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and on and on, and on we go. The big thing, though, is that this network over the last 20 years, over the last 23 years, has expanded and contracted. Florida used to collect data once upon a time. They're no longer involved in the network. There have been states like New Jersey, which was part of the network to begin with, and then they fell out of the network, and then they came back into the network. And Arizona has been a part of the network from the beginning. So different data from different locations is collected, but all of this is fed back into the CDC, and we're all collecting data on populations of tens of thousands of people. And the CDC has all kinds of statisticians and epidemiology experts and public health experts to help determine the identified prevalence of autism. And so this kind of just gives you a sense of the breadth of where we're collecting data from. So how exactly do we collect data? What does this data collection process look like? The first thing we do is we identify places in our community to get information. This system, this public health surveillance system, we do not engage in any diagnostic evaluations. That is not our job. That's not what we want to do. We want to assess various education records and health records to determine who exactly has autism, what services they're receiving, how they were diagnosed, but we're not engaging in any of that diagnostic work ourselves. So we had to identify places in our community that educate, diagnose, treat, and provide services to children with autism. And while those of us on this call may say, well, that's really easy, right? Kids go to school. It turns out, especially 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. There are some school districts, not necessarily here in Arizona, but there are some school districts around the country where children with special disabilities are sent to larger school districts to receive services. And so we have to kind of think through, okay, where are children located? This isn't an issue here in Arizona, but for other sites and other states, that is a topic of consideration. So we have to figure out, where are we getting our data from? In a place like Atlanta or in Philadelphia, where there are sites, there are multiple health systems that have to be consulted to get information from. Here in Arizona, we have 2 health systems, especially in our data collection area, that serve children with autism, and that's the Banner Health System and Phoenix Children's Hospital. So once we identify our sources and we get agreement from our sources, we send in a team of data abstractors to essentially review the special education and clinical records of children who were diagnosed with autism and other developmental disabilities, and we're looking for behaviors that are consistent with autism. That has changed in recent years. We don't just look now for behaviors consistent with autism. We look specifically whether or not a child is receiving a special education exceptionality for autism, meaning that they are specifically in special education because they have autism, or because they have been actively diagnosed with autism, which means that they have the ICD codes or a DSM code that says that they have autism. In the distant past, many years ago, especially when there was concern about how children were receiving services in the community and how they were being diagnosed by community providers, we would review records, and based on expert documentation of various symptoms and various challenges, a clinician reviewer who would review the information that was collected by the abstractors would say this individual is likely to have autism or not. We don't do that anymore. We haven't done that for probably at this point 5 or 6 years because we are confident in the ability of our education system across the country and our health system across the country to catch those individuals affected by autism. So once we have collected all this data, once we've kind of entered it into databases, we de-identify it. No personal information is ever shared with anyone. That's not what we want to do. We instead de-identify that information, and then we transmit it to the CDC, and they compile it all together. So Arizona sends their information to the CDC, Pennsylvania, California, the 2 sites in Texas, everyone sends their data to the CDC. The CDC kind of combines it all together. They use various statistical algorithms to weight the data. So that way certain parts of the population that may be underrepresented in our data collection are statistically adequately represented, and different sites have different populations. Arizona tends to have a smaller number of children that we collect data from, whereas sites in Atlanta tend to have a larger number of children they collect data from. So that all has to be balanced out, and the CDC takes care of that. So the CDC analyzes this data, it then publishes it in something called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. This is kind of the CDC's journal of saying, hey, this is what we've been doing. And that's where we get our big X in Y number, currently 1 in 36. And that information is published, it's presented back to the community. And then part of what we do, part of our mission out here in Arizona and across sites across the country, is to make presentations like this one, where we discuss not just what we're doing and why we're doing it, but also what did we find, because that's really important. So I went over a little bit about how we identify autism cases. Currently, the 3 major ways we identify autism cases are based on a clinical diagnosis or a special education exceptionality, as well as, especially for 4-year-olds, because we collect data on children who are both 4 and 8 years of age. We also consider what are called diagnostic statements. So these are statements that are written usually by a clinician, sometimes by a qualified education specialist, that says that this child most likely has autism, but for whatever reason, I'm not confident in making a formal diagnosis. That's much more common among 4-year-olds and for children who, especially in the early part of their clinical record, and that has to do with the fact that that diagnosing autism is very often a long and convoluted process, and so as part of that process, you have to rule out certain other challenges and conditions. And when a child, especially when they're 2, 3, 4 years of age, they may not be old enough to rule out other causes for various symptoms. And so some clinicians will take what could amount to a wait and see approach before they make a formal diagnosis, but they'll put in the clinical record, we think that this kid has autism. We're just not quite ready to make that formal diagnosis. But we consider that a diagnosis of autism, and that's something that that would then trigger the abstraction process. So what exactly is the abstraction process? Well, first and foremost, before we can even abstract anything, before we even do any of the work that we do, a parent, a caregiver, a physician, some other responsible adult recognizes the need for evaluation. There's a problem with a kid. This problem can be seen in the home, it can be seen in education, it can come from grandparents, but someone has to say, I think something's wrong with my kid. Or I think there's something wrong with the kid. This could be delayed speech, this could be certain maladaptive behaviors, this could be any number of things, but somebody is recognizing that something doesn't quite feel right, and we should do something about that. Then an evaluation itself has to take place. So if you're a parent, you're a caregiver, you're some kind of other adult, you need to go to your doctor, and your doctor has to make a referral, and you have to go through the evaluation process. Or if you're being identified as having autism in the schools, right, you have to go through the school psychology and special education process. And so they conduct their own kinds of evaluations. Then the evaluator has to correctly recognize that a child has autism. They have to say, yeah, I think these behaviors, I think these symptoms that I'm observing are consistent with autism. And that leads to them making a notation in the record that the kid has autism. And that's what triggers us as the surveillance team to say, okay, now we're going to go through and we're going to collect all this information that you see on your screens. We're going to see we're going to collect the information. What were parents concerned about? We're going to collect information about the evaluation, what tests were done, how did children score on the various tests, what were the clinician's observations. We're going to collect all that information. But if this entire process doesn't happen, and we don't get that autism-related diagnosis or autism-related behavior being documented in a record, we can't abstract. Doesn't matter if the parent thinks that a kid has autism, if that isn't formally documented somewhere, we miss it. So this entire process is really important for us being able to collect reliable data, but we only see this at the end. And we recognize that there are lots of different moving parts that happen prior to us coming in to make this kind of big public health determination. So what are the pros and cons of this process? Because there are pros and cons to any kind of process. The big pro is that we get access to details. Oftentimes when we track diseases, and all of us can kind of reflect on that contact tracing and tracking the numbers of COVID that we all kind of lived through over the last 3 years. We're not just checking, well, have you had a positive rapid test, or did you send your sample off to a lab and it's a yes, no if you have COVID. Autism is much more complicated than that, and we can collect a lot of really rich, granular information that really tells us how autism presents in different communities, among different ethnicities, between the genders. We also have strong confidence in the diagnostic accuracy of this, because you've gone through a clinical or special education evaluation before a child is diagnosed with autism. We're not relying on someone saying, yeah, my kid's diagnosed with autism, or someone who says, oh, I don't think my kid has autism. We're not relying on people remembering or misremembering something. We're relying on what amounts to fact. And this process also includes those who have not received a comprehensive evaluation. One of the big things, especially 20 years ago when they set up this process, and they were trying to figure out, should we collect information from school districts, or should we just ignore school districts altogether? One of the big challenges, and one of the challenges that still exists today, is that we don't have enough providers in our community who can diagnose autism. And the wait times, as I'm sure many of you who are parents with children with autism, or who may have autism yourselves and had to wait for a diagnostic evaluation, the wait times can be horrendously long, and especially for a clinical diagnosis. So if we're relying only on comprehensive evaluations that are done by trained clinicians, we would miss a lot of information. So by including school districts and special education records, we can get a richer understanding of our community that is affected by autism. That being said, there are some cons to this process as well. First of which, it's time consuming. It requires a ton of time, a ton of effort to create relationships with school districts and get access to school district information. And there are various laws that have to be addressed before we can even access that information. So it's incredibly time consuming. It's so time consuming, in fact, that we only publish data once every other year, because it takes us a year and a half to collect data. So right now we are in what we call surveillance year or study year 2022. We are collecting data on children who are age 4 or age 8 for at least one day in calendar year 2022. So not only can we not really begin our data collection and data abstraction efforts until the calendar year is over, it takes us a year and a half to get the data and process the data and get it to the CDC. And then the CDC takes another couple of months to analyze the data and then publish it out and so forth. There are also scope limitations. We only collect data in a study area, and we're going to go over what that study area here in Arizona looks like in just a second. But we only collect data on a specific study area. So we miss certain people because we're collecting granular pieces of information. We can't really go as broad as we may like to. We also miss certain things because we're partnering with health organizations and special education systems. We miss children who might be homeschooled, which has become quite prevalent, especially after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. If you don't have a clinical diagnosis and you haven't interacted with the public school system, we don't see that information. We don't see that data.
Then don't do that.
And then finally, we have we kind of exclude those who have not yet been diagnosed or recognized as having autism. And there are plenty of children who are diagnosed long after they are 8 years of age. So if they haven't been diagnosed, no one has made a diagnostic statement on their record, they're not receiving special education services, we miss them. They're not, that we can't collect their data because they're not, they don't, there are no flags in their information that would have us analyze their data in the first place. So I've talked a little bit about how Arizona has been a part of the surveillance effort since surveillance year 2000, but how have we in Arizona contributed to this? Well, we've been collecting data here in Arizona from the Phoenix metro area for 23 years. One of the reasons we collect that data in Phoenix has to do with the fact that in 2000, the population of Tucson was just not big enough for us, for the demographers and the statistical wizards at the CDC to be able to reliably analyze the data. The Phoenix metro area, however, was sufficiently sized at the time, and so we collect the data in the Phoenix metro area. And one of the really big important pieces of the data collection effort is that the surveillance area has to be contiguous. And the way that we defined our surveillance area is based on the boundaries of school districts. So even though Tucson has become appropriately sized, even though we could potentially collect data from both Tucson and Phoenix, in order to be able to reliably collect that data, we would have to collect data from school districts between Tucson and Phoenix. And that becomes a very, very large and very overwhelming process. So kind of by inertia, this project has been maintained in the Phoenix area. But because Phoenix and Maricopa County represent 60% of the state's population, we have a high degree of confidence that the data we collect from Phoenix is, broadly speaking, reflective of the population of the state of Arizona at large. There are some qualifiers and limitations to that, but broadly speaking, in the broad strokes, because so many people live in the Phoenix metro area, we have confidence in the what we call generalizability of our data. So we not only collect data, clinical data from Banner Health Systems and Phoenix Children's Hospital, we also collect it from numerous school districts. In this picture, you can see Maricopa County in the state of Arizona and where our surveillance site is currently located. So we collect data from Mesa, Gilbert, Balls, Tempe, Kyrene, and Levine school districts. And one of the big changes that the CDC made for both this surveillance year in 2022 as well as surveillance year 2024 is not only are we collecting data from within school district boundaries, the data that we collect, children's information that we abstract, has to come from children who live in what are called census tracts that are wholly within the school district boundaries. If you've never heard of a census tract, that's perfectly okay. It is a way for the US Census Bureau to kind of apportion the population and to understand how the population is spread around the country. Because we know that a lot of people can live in a very small space and very few people can live in a very large space. And census tracts are all very, very roughly speaking, the same size. I think there's a range of about 4,000 to 7,000 people who live in a given census tract. While that sounds like a big range, right? That's 3,000 individuals. When we're talking about a population of 330 million, a difference of 3,000 is nothing. So this is information that the census uses. And so we as public health experts and as epidemiologists and as people who analyze this data, we are collecting information on people who live in these little kind of census tracts, these ways we split up our population based on where they live, that are wholly within the school district and the school district zone. So this is kind of the surveillance area we collect our data from. And one of the reasons we like the surveillance area is that Mesa is the largest school district in the entire state of Arizona. And we have worked with all of these districts in some way, shape, or form for the better part of 20 years. So we have a lot of data that not only is collected across state for 20 years, it's been collected in the same place for 20 years. So we can really look at temporal trends, changes over time. So how exactly have things changed over time? To quote my dear colleague, Dr. Sidney Pettygrove, there's a general upness to the numbers. So prior to the mid-1990s, we were thinking of autism as being a rare disease that only affects a handful of kids per 10,000 people. In 2000, when we collected data on children who were born in 1992, we found that the prevalence of autism was actually about 6 per 1,000 children. And that was both the case here in Arizona, as well as across the United States. As we have collected data, again, every even numbered year since 2000, we've seen that the numbers have risen. Arizona accelerated a little more than the US as a whole, but we have largely gone in the same direction as the US as a whole, which is that the prevalence of autism is rising, and it has been rising pretty steadily. And if you look at this chart, especially since 2012. The rise in the prevalence of autism seems to be accelerating. It's not a very linear, methodical rise up. It looks a little bit like an exponential curve. Now that could change in 2022. I don't know. We haven't analyzed the data. And this is why we do what we do, because we thought this was a rare condition. And the reality is that autism is pretty common. It's affecting almost 3% of our kids. And in fact, there's a lot of conversation in the research world. Should we stop reporting numbers per 1,000 children? Should we just start reporting percentages? Because that's how common autism has started to become. So what does this all mean? Where do we go from here? The first big thing is that we collect this data, but it's you, the community, who decides what to do with this. One of the big things that communities do is you advocate. You advocate for education changes, for reasonable accommodations through employers. And yes, there are federal laws that require employers to provide reasonable accommodation, but encouraging employers to engage with the autism community, to hire people with autism when they otherwise may not consider that a person to hire. Developing community services and supports. This is driven by you, the community. We provide you the information, and I may have lots of opinions on what should be done with the information, but my opinions may not match with what the community needs at large, or what a specific community needs. And I currently live in the Phoenix area. Tucson is a very different place than Phoenix. People in Tucson love to hate Phoenix with burning passion of 1,000 suns. People in Phoenix kind of forget that Tucson exists. But I know Tucson exists. It's near and dear to my heart. It always will be. But the needs of Tucson are very different. Tucson, generally speaking, as a city, is poorer than most of the Phoenix and Phoenix metro area. So the interventions that are going to be launched at a local level are going to look very different, because the tax base is different. The resources that are available are different. It's also important to realize that autism is a lifelong condition. Through this project, we only collect data on children up to age 8. There is something called a National Health Interview Survey, where people are contacted every year. And one of the questions that are asked on the National Health Interview Survey is, has your child been diagnosed with autism in the last 12 months? And has your child ever been diagnosed with autism? So, we're kind of relying on people's memory or people's opinion or their willingness to be honest on the survey. But that only goes up to when children are 17. Once you're 18, you're no longer considered a child legally, and the National Health Interview Survey doesn't ask those questions. But autism is a lifelong condition. So we stop collecting information on people with autism once they stop being children. We know, based on some very rigorous research, that at least 50,000 children with autism turn 18 every year. And as the prevalence of autism rises, that number is going to rise. But we know nothing about the needs of that population. So this information provides us a great starting point. 3% of kids who are aged 8 years old in 2020 have autism. What's that going to mean 10 or 20 years from now, when they graduate high school, when they go to college, when they join the workforce? There's evidence to suggest that in the first 2 years after separation from high school, 50% of children, or 50% of young adults with autism, disappear, meaning they are not engaged with services, they are not employed, and they're not pursuing education. We don't know what happens to them. I colloquially call this, they go into mom and dad's basement, because I'm assuming they're still being cared for. We don't have we don't see these individuals, so that they're clearly being cared for somewhere. After about 2 years, a fraction of these individuals kind of reemerge, and they start pursuing services, are employed, are pursuing education, but up to a quarter don't. And we don't know what happens to them. We don't know what their needs are. We know nothing. We know next to nothing about that population. And so this is where community advocacy really comes into play. And it was community advocacy and parent groups lobbying Congress that got us to have the surveillance system in the first place. And so it's community groups such as you guys who are going to help decide where we go next and what we do next. And then, of course, there's also designing autism-friendly communities and engaging in the process of universal design and an inclusive design where appropriate. And that's, again, that's driven by you, the community. We can provide you the data, we can give you the information to take action, but what that action is and what that looks like and how that manifests, that's up to you. And so, as you may have guessed, surveillance is only the beginning. Surveillance only tells us who's affected, where they're living, and when they're affected. When meaning when they're, in this case, when they're diagnosed and how old they are. We still need to assess the population's needs as a whole. We don't collect any information directly. We don't interview individuals with autism. We don't conduct focus groups with people affected by autism. That's not something that this process does. We don't do what is called a needs assessment. So surveillance really is only the beginning. And many things happen outside of the scope of surveillance. I just talked about how it was parent groups lobbying Congress for change, for money being made available. That's law and policy. The data influences laws and policy. So, for example, one of the big law changes over the last 10 to 15 years is that every state in the United States requires insurances to reimburse for ABA therapy. Now, a lot of people have a lot of opinions about ABA therapy, whether it's effective or not. That's kind of outside, it's definitely outside the scope of surveillance efforts. But this is a law change. And one of the reasons that law was changed was because there is a higher and growing portion of the population that is affected by autism. And if insurances weren't required by law to cover ABA services, and that was a therapeutic route you as a family chose to go to serve your kid with autism, you may be stuck with a bill of hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of dollars. So this data, in part, in a very small way, helped drive legal and policy changes. And that wasn't just at a federal level, that was on a state-by-state level. And this data also drives research questions. There are tons of research questions and thousands of researchers who are researching autism and doing things in and related to the autism community. And all of them refer back to this data. All of them, without exception. So this really is just the beginning, and there's so much more that you, the community, can do, and so much change that you, the community, can promote. So on that note, that is all I have for you. So if you have any questions at all about this, about autism surveillance, this presentation, anything, please feel free to contact me at the email on your screen. If you Google my name, one of the first hits, if not the first hit, is my ASU search page, which will take you straight to my ASU little bio, and it includes my email there. So you don't even have to remember my email, although my email is pretty easy to remember. You just have to remember my name. And so with that, do you guys have any questions?
I have a question to kick us off while people are thinking.
Absolutely.
So just as a feeling from the research community and all the people working on this sort of project, how are you guys looking at or thinking about the fact that so many more people are getting diagnosed as adults in the last couple of years? Is that anywhere in, like, how is that being discussed, or how does it affect?
So it has been discussed at some length in the research community. It's the problem that exists is that we don't have enough providers to diagnose autism generally, let alone who are able to diagnose autism in adults. And there has been a prevailing theory, both in research and in clinical practice, that once you reach adulthood, you've kind of figured things out. And so what does it matter if you have or don't have a diagnosis? If you've successfully reached adulthood, you're good to go. Now, we know it's much more complicated than that. We know that that's not necessarily true. But that's been kind of the thought process there. And one of the big policy pushes has been to put a lot of emphasis, effort, and energy and money, most importantly, money, behind early identification and early diagnosis of autism. There are a variety of reasons for that. Early intervention is always going to be more effective than later intervention. Prevention is always going to be better than trying to cure something down the line. Not that we necessarily want to cure autism. In fact, there's no necessary reason to cure autism. That's been a big sticking point among autistic self-advocates, of which I am one. So, we don't want to necessarily go down that route, but we know that this early intervention, that doing stuff early on is going to lead to better, more positive outcomes. And when we have limited resources and limited budgets and limited personnel, where do we want to put our effort and energy? And so we target that on young children. Now that does leave a massive gap for those who are diagnosed after age 8, and especially those that are seeking out answers in adulthood and are seeking out services and supports in adulthood. And so this is going to be a challenge that we have to deal with, and we don't quite have an answer on how we want to do that just yet.
That makes sense. Wonder what it was.
It's a fantastic question.
Tangentially from, this very non-numerical, whatever. It's definitely something we get a lot of. This has exponentially gone up in the last couple of years. So it's going to be interesting to see where all of the autism, everything goes in the next decade, as we've come so far in this last decade, and where it goes the next one. It's going to be very interesting.
Oh, yes.
Very cool. Are there any other questions from anybody? I had one other random question. When you say that kids are so like, and this may be more new also, but kids are being, when they're associated with the public school systems, are they counting ESA kids or just kids that are in, like, if you have an autism on your IEP or MET and you get ESA in one of those school districts, are they being counted or are they not?
So that is a fantastic question. This is something that we have to confront specifically here in Arizona. So if you have an IEP or a 504 plan, you have engaged with the public education school system, which means that you have a special education record, which means that we would vacuum it up in terms of establishing a case finding list and then saying, okay, we want to analyze these records. And if a special education exceptionality is noted for autism or a select other number of developmental disabilities, then we abstract and review the record. ESAs though are an interesting beast, because you can get ESAs through school districts without ever having sent your kid to the school. And when that happens, a special education record is not created, which means that we are blind to that child's existence through the education system. Now, if they're clinically diagnosed, we'll find them that way.
Okay.
But if they're not clinically diagnosed, or they're clinically diagnosed from someone who's not one of our clinical partners, and they only have an ESA, and we don't see that information, that's not part of the information we collect. And they went through that ESA route without ever having enrolled their kid in public school, then we get nothing. We don't see them. Now, one of the big questions, especially because this ESA phenomenon in terms of being able to get an ESA without having sent your kid first to public school, that's a new phenomenon here in Arizona the last, I think, about year, maybe year and a half. It's a new law. And so we don't know if those children who may go and get an ESA, get an exceptionality for autism noted, they go through homeschooling or private schooling, we don't capture them as part of our surveillance system. and then they subsequently return to the public school system for whatever reason, we may capture them that way. But we won't know what that looks like until it happens. And unless there is reference in the education information that we collect as part of the special education record for an ESA, we won't know if they had an ESA or not. It's a very complicated process because ESAs are a separate system from special education. We are only focused on special education records. So, and there are lots of challenges in and around and with the ESA process that I know the Department of Education is working out. And I don't want to, and I cannot speak for them. I am not affiliated with the Arizona Department of Education in any way whatsoever. So that there are lots of unknown questions. From a data perspective, if children who bypass the public education system via an ESA then return to the public education system, then we will capture them. But if they don't do that by the time they turn 8 years of age, in a surveillance year where we're conducting surveillance, then they will not be captured as part of the as part of our public health surveillance efforts.
It'd be really interesting to see what it does to the numbers, because I know so many, like even like my daughter, she couldn't have handled public school, so we just went around that straight to private school because it was.
Well, and that's another challenge of this process as well, is we don't collect data from the private schools, and we have a very robust charter school system here in Arizona. We don't collect data from the charter schools either. Part of the reason for that is that, especially in the charter school system, there's kind of a self-selection bias that unless it's specifically an autism-related school, private or charter, are there going to be children with special education needs in those schools? Are they going to be receiving special education services, even if they have special education needs? And so it was decided long before I became involved that that wasn't a route that we were going to pursue, because we would end up trying to collect information that would ultimately not contribute to our understanding of the prevalence of autism here in Arizona. That doesn't mean it's not important information. It's a reflection of the fact that we have a year and a half to collect data. We have the budget that we have to do this with, and we have limited resources. So what's the best way we can do this? But especially in states like Arizona, where we are increasingly making our charter school system more robust, and we're providing more and different avenues to both charter and private education, it is something that we need to consider and we need to think about when we look at Arizona's numbers. That being said, Arizona's numbers follow the national trends pretty squarely. We're usually pretty on point with them. So that only reinforces that we're probably on the right path. But should we deviate pretty significantly from the national numbers in any direction, we may need to ask, what are we doing that's leading us to be so different than the rest of the country? Is something happening in Arizona? Is there something going on with our methods, or is there something else entirely going on?
Josh, is there any place that's like that now that's not Arizona?
Yes, there are. That's a fantastic question. So if you go and you pull up the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report that documents the autism prevalence for 8-year-olds in 2018 and 2020, if you look at that, California's numbers are through the metaphorical roof. They are very, very high, like 50 or 60 per 1,000 kids, which is double everyone else. And part of that reason is that we recently, or when the data collection efforts in California began, it wasn't known to everyone that California, or that in San Diego, the US Navy tends to park families affected by autism in San Diego. That is a Department of Defense and Department of the Navy decision that they make. I'm not entirely clear as to why they make that decision. That's a great question for the Navy. As I understand it, it's because there are services there that are available to those families. There's a robust service system already in place in San Diego. And so those decisions that are made by the Department of the Navy. And so the data collection area.
Sorry, Josh.
Sorry,
Wouldn't
go
they
ahead.
already have to have a diagnosis anyway then for that to matter?
Yes, but remember that we only collect the data at age 4 and age 8. And so the surveillance system in California is like ours in Arizona. It's a school district zone in San Diego County. San Diego County is a pretty big county. And so it's just a collection of school districts. I forget which school districts in San Diego County, but it's a collection of school districts. And I believe where they collect the data happens to be where Navy families go to live and then send their kids to school and then are getting services from the hospitals and resources that are based in the area. And so we collect that data. And so that has led to, well, okay, now there's a bunch of kids who have autism. Or in California, there are a bunch of kids who have autism relative to the rest of the network. Is there something special going on in California? No, it just so happens that there are choices that are being made that has led to this occurrence. I suspect if you were to collect data somewhere else in California, Fresno, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, the numbers would look very different. But that's because there's been a decision that was made that led to this outcome. On the flip side of that coin, New Jersey has always consistently had, until California came along, the highest or one of the highest prevalences of autism that a state location or that a site would have. And that is because that New Jersey has built into their gas tax a specific tax that benefits children with autism. And so there are a lot of services that are available for children with autism in New Jersey compared to other sites around the country, not just within the ADAM network. And so one of the big features with autism, especially early on, was that, well, if I diagnose you with autism and there are no services available, why should I label you? There's no benefit to me providing that label as a clinician, as a diagnostician. But in New Jersey, there is a benefit because there are robust services available, because this is literally built in to the way New Jersey collects money and appropriates that money. So that leads to a higher prevalence because there are resources to take advantage of. And so those are kind of contextual pieces of information that you need to know about the surveillance sites when you interpret information. In Arizona, we don't have the Department of Defense sticking people out here just because they're affected by autism. We don't have special services built into our tax code. So we are, of course, going to be a little different. Again, when the numbers are averaged out and all the statistical work is done, we come out pretty much in the middle of the pack, following the national average pretty gosh darn closely. And so that gives us confidence that we're on the right path, even though we're going to miss certain things. We're not collecting data in Tucson. That's a limitation. That's a huge limitation. Tucson is a big city. If I were to lift up Tucson and drop it into New Mexico, it'd be the largest city in New Mexico by a landslide. If I were to pick Tucson up and drop it into New York State, it would be the second biggest city in New York by twice. It's twice the size of the city of Buffalo. Tucson's a big city, but we don't collect data there. Could Tucson be different than Phoenix? Absolutely. I don't have reason to believe that the numbers would be radically different in Tucson than Phoenix, having lived in both communities and knowing the data as I do and knowing Arizona as I do, but it's a possibility, and we can't rule it out. And so we have to remember that, keep that in mind when we kind of work with these numbers. And if you were going to make advocacy choices in California, I would say, hey, by the way, just be forewarned, you have numbers that are really high based on decisions that are outside of everyone in the state of California's control. That's a federal decision that's being made.
I have one last question.
Mhm.
If it's okay. What at some point after collecting all the data, and I know it's like every every 2 years. At some point, would you expect to see this rise neutralize more and just plateau more? Or because like, does that make sense of like, okay,
Makes
maybe
sense.
we're collecting this data and now people are getting better diagnosed and this help, blah blah blah. But then at some point, would you expect it to just kind of like plateau?
That is a great question, and that has been brought up in research circles many times, that especially as we get better at diagnosing things and we have a better understanding and we raise awareness, that eventually this rise in autism will stop. Because the one of the big questions has been, is autism really is it a rare disease, or is it something that has always been part of the human condition, and only in the last few decades, the last century or so, we've been equipped to accurately and effectively diagnose? There are advocates on both sides of that issue. If you fall in the camp that that it's just a matter of raising awareness and having tools available, making those tools available to the population, having enough clinicians and diagnosticians and resources in a community to be able to make a diagnosis and do something about that diagnosis once it's made. Eventually we should reach a point where, okay, we kind of know that X percentage of the population is affected by autism, and that should level off. The counter argument to that is that we're not seeing that level off, and if anything, we're seeing an acceleration in the number of children identified as having autism, which would suggest that there's something out there that's causing autism, whether it's genetics, whether it's an environmental exposure, whether it's a combination of genetics and an environmental exposure, whether it's something else entirely. We don't know. The truth of the matter is we do not know what causes autism. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that it's genetic in nature, but we don't know what genes or what sequence of genes causes autism to occur. We know that there are strong associations with environmental exposures, but they're not robustly causative. We just know that your likelihood of being exposed to, example, heavy metals, mercury, lead, that sort of thing, leads to an increased likelihood of a child being diagnosed with autism. So that would suggest that there's probably some what we call epigenetic, environmental, and genetic interplay that's going on, but we don't know what that is. So it could very well be that there's something else entirely that's going on. These are the two camps. And I think I suspect that there's truth in both of them. That there is something going on epigenetically, but we also have become a lot more aware of autism. We have a lot more robust tools, and we have people who are trained to recognize autism, diagnose autism, provide services for autism, and so that's also helping to explain the increase in the rate that autism is diagnosed. And so it's a kind of a stay tuned. If the numbers start plateauing out, we'll all be very excited. If the numbers don't start plateauing out, we'll all be very excited. So let me come back in a couple of years and I'll tell you.
Perfect. Thank you for answering my questions.
Well, thank you so much, Josh. This was very, very informational and important, and just really good information to have. I really appreciate you coming, and I am excited to be able to share this with everybody too. Thank you for letting us record. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I'll be sending out a link to the whole thing, so if anybody needs it for anything, it'll be out there. Thank you so much.
Sounds good. Thank you.